The woman with dark hair and a faded green dress stood in the doorway of the boarding house, her small leather satchel clutched against her chest, and the landlady's words still ringing in her ears like a death knell. "We don't rent to your kind here." Natalie Reed had heard variations of that sentence 7 times in the past 2 hours, as she'd walked from establishment to establishment in Shoshone, Idaho, this dusty railroad town, where she'd stepped off the train with hope in her heart and exactly $3.40 to her name. The sun beat down mercilessly on the unpaved Main Street, and she could feel the stares of townspeople burning into her back as she stood there, frozen between humiliation and desperation, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake leaving Virginia City after the scandal that had destroyed her reputation through no fault of her own. The year was 1882, and Shoshone had grown quickly around the railroad depot, a place where miners, ranchers, and railroad workers mingled with merchants and families trying to build something permanent in the unforgiving Idaho territory. Natalie had believed she could disappear here, start fresh where nobody knew about the lies Thomas Whitmore had spread after she'd refused his advances, where nobody had heard the whispers that she'd been involved with a married man, even though the truth was she'd simply witnessed something she shouldn't have, and became inconvenient to powerful people. But somehow, word had traveled faster than the train that brought her. Or perhaps it was simply the fact that she was a woman alone without references, without family, without anyone to vouch for her character in a town that valued such things above almost everything else. She walked slowly down the wooden sidewalk, her boots making hollow sounds against the planks, passing the general store where the owner had taken one look at her and said his rooms were full even though she could see the vacancy sign still hanging in the window. The saloon keeper had been cruder, suggesting she could work for him in a capacity that made her stomach turn. The hotel manager had simply shaken his head before she'd even finished asking. The woman who ran the small restaurant with rooms above had looked almost sympathetic, but still closed the door in her face, whispering something about reputation and respectable establishments. Natalie's throat felt tight, and she refused to let the tears building behind her eyes fall where anyone could see them. She'd survived worse than this, hadn't she? She'd survived her father's death when she was 16. Survived working in a textile mill for 2 years until her hands bled, survived the journey west, survived the false accusations and the way her former employer's wife had looked at her with such hatred despite knowing the truth. She would survive this too, somehow. The street curved slightly at the edge of town where the buildings grew more scattered, giving way to smaller structures, and eventually the open land beyond where cattle grazed in the distance, and the mountains rose up purple and imposing against the endless blue sky. She noticed a small ranch house set back from the road, weathered wood and a sloping roof, a barn nearby, and a corral where several horses stood swishing their tails against the afternoon heat. A man was working near the barn, his broad shoulders moving as he hammered something she couldn't quite see from this distance. She had no reason to approach, no reason to think he'd be any different from the others, but her feet were aching, her head was pounding from the sun and lack of water, and she was running out of options as surely as she was running out of daylight. The man looked up as she approached, pausing mid-swing with his hammer, and she could see the surprise register on his tanned face, the way his dark eyes tracked her movements as she walked up the dusty path toward his property. "Help you with something, miss?" His voice was deeper than she'd expected, carrying easily across the distance between them, and there was a wariness in his tone that she'd become intimately familiar with over the course of this terrible afternoon. Natalie stopped a respectful distance away, aware of how she must look, dusty and desperate and alone, I'm looking for a place to stay, just a room, somewhere safe. I can pay." Her voice came out stronger than she felt, and she was grateful for that small mercy at least. The man set down his hammer and walked closer, and she could see him more clearly now. He was tall, probably in his mid-20s, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that was handsome in a rough, weathered way that spoke of long days in the sun and hard work. He wore simple clothes, a worn shirt with the sleeves rolled up revealing strong forearms, canvas pants, and boots that had seen better years. There was something careful in the way he moved, like a man used to considering his actions before taking them. "You been to town already?" It wasn't really a question, more of a statement, and Natalie felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the sun. "Yes," she saw no point in lying. "Everyone has made it clear they have no room for me." He studied her for a long moment, and she forced herself to meet his gaze, to let him see that whatever he'd heard or whatever he assumed, she was still a person who deserved basic human dignity. Something shifted in his expression, a tightening around his mouth that might have been anger, though she didn't think it was directed at her. "Xavier Pearson," he said finally, not offering his hand because that would have been too familiar, but giving her his name, which felt like something. "This is my ranch. Small operation, just me and the horses, mostly some cattle. Natalie Reed." She hesitated, then added, "I came here looking for work, for a fresh start. I have skills, I can sew and cook and keep accounts. I'm not asking for charity, just a chance." Xavier turned slightly, looking back toward his house, and she could see him weighing something in his mind, some decision that seemed to cost him more than she understood. When he turned back, his jaw was set in a way that spoke of determination. "I've got a spare room." Was my sister's before she married and moved to Boise 3 months back. "It's not much, but it's clean and it's got a good lock on the door." The relief that flooded through Natalie was so intense it made her dizzy, but she forced herself to stay standing, to stay composed. "I can pay you not much, but something every week once I find work. We'll figure that out later." Xavier gestured toward the house. "You look about ready to fall over. There's a pump around the side, water's cold and clean. I'll show you the room and you can get settled. I've got work to finish before dark, but there's bread and some cold chicken in the kitchen if you're hungry." Natalie followed him toward the house, hardly daring to believe her luck was finally turning, hardly daring to question why this man was willing to help her when everyone else had turned her away. The house was small but well maintained, and she could see evidence of careful living in the swept porch and the neat stack of firewood by the door. Xavier led her inside to a front room with simple furniture, everything worn but clean, then down a short hallway to a bedroom that was indeed small but had a real bed with a quilt, a washstand, and a window that looked out toward the mountains. "I'll leave you to it," Xavier said, already backing toward the door. "I sleep in the room at the other end of the house. Door stays locked on both sides if that makes you feel safer. I'm not expecting anything from you, Miss Reed, just so we're clear on that. You need a place to stay, I've got a place. That's all this is." Before she could thank him properly, he was gone, his footsteps echoing back through the house and then the sound of the front door closing behind him. Natalie sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, her satchel still clutched in her hands, and finally let herself cry, silent tears running down her face, as the tension and fear of the day released all at once. She'd found shelter, at least for tonight, offered by a stranger who'd shown her more kindness in 5 minutes than an entire town had in hours. She washed her face and hands at the pump outside, the cold water shocking and wonderful against her sun-heated skin, then went inside and found the kitchen where indeed there was bread and chicken as promised. She ate sparingly, not wanting to take advantage, then returned to her room and unpacked her few belongings, hanging her one other dress on the peg by the door and arranging her brush and few personal items on the washstand. Through the window she could see Xavier back at work by the barn, his movements steady and purposeful, and she wondered what had made him different, what had made him willing to open his door when everyone else had slammed theirs shut. That night she lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling around her, the distant call of coyotes, the rustle of wind through the grass, the soft movements of horses in the corral. She heard Xavier come in much later, his boots heavy on the wooden floors, the sound of water being poured, a door closing. She listened to the silence that followed and felt something loosen in her chest, some tight knot of fear that had been there so long she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. Morning came early on a ranch, and Natalie woke to pale light filtering through her window and the sound of someone moving around in the kitchen. She dressed quickly in her same faded green dress, pinned her dark hair back as neatly as she could manage, and ventured out to find Xavier standing at the stove frying eggs and bacon in a cast iron pan. He glanced up when she entered, his expression unreadable in the early morning shadows. "Coffee's ready," he said, gesturing to the pot on the back of the stove. "Help yourself." She poured a cup, grateful for the warmth and the sharp, bitter taste that helped clear the fog from her head. "Thank you for letting me stay. I know you didn't have to do that." Xavier flipped the eggs with practiced efficiency. "I saw you yesterday, walking from door to door. Saw the way Martha Wilson shut her boarding house door in your face. Saw the way you just kept walking with your head up like it didn't hurt even though it clearly did. Figured if you had that much strength, you deserved better than sleeping in the street." The honesty of his words caught her off guard, and she found herself looking at him more carefully, noticing the way his hands moved with confidence, the set of his shoulders, the slight lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more than his current serious expression indicated. "Why would you help me when nobody else would?" He was quiet for a moment, dividing the food onto 2 plates. "My mother was turned away from every door in a town once, before I was born. My father found her half frozen in a snowstorm, sitting outside the church because even the preacher wouldn't let her in when he heard she was pregnant and unmarried. My father brought her home, married her the next week, and loved her until the day she died giving birth to my sister 15 years later. I grew up knowing that sometimes good people end up in bad situations, and that judgment comes a lot easier to folks than compassion." Natalie took the plate he offered, their fingers briefly touching in the exchange, and she felt a spark of something she couldn't quite name. They ate in silence at the small kitchen table, and she realized it was a comfortable silence, the kind that didn't need filling with unnecessary words. When they finished, she insisted on washing the dishes while he went out to tend to the horses, and she found herself looking around the kitchen with new eyes, seeing the small ways it could be improved, the curtains that needed mending, the floor that could use a good scrubbing. She spent the morning cleaning, unable to just sit idle when there was work to be done, and when Xavier came in for lunch, he stopped in the doorway of the kitchen with a look of surprise at the transformation. "You didn't have to do all this. I needed to do something." Natalie wiped her hands on the apron she'd found hanging on a hook. "I'm not good at sitting still and you're letting me stay here. It's the least I can do." Something changed in his expression, a softening that made him look younger, and he nodded slowly. "Appreciate it. House has needed a woman's touch since Sarah left. I'm not much for the details." Over the next few days they fell into an easy routine. Natalie would wake early and make breakfast. Xavier would work on the ranch, and she would spend her days cleaning and mending and organizing the house that had been neglected in the subtle ways that happen when someone lives alone. She fixed the curtains, scrubbed the floors until they gleamed, organized the pantry, and even tackled the accumulation of mending that Xavier had stuffed into a basket and apparently hoped would magically fix itself. In the evenings they would eat together, and slowly Xavier began to talk more, telling her about the ranch, about his plans to expand the horse breeding operation, about the challenges of making a living in this harsh but beautiful country. Natalie found herself talking too, carefully at first, then with growing trust, telling him about her father who'd been a schoolteacher before a fever took him, about her dream of opening a dressmaking shop someday, about the books she loved to read when she could find them. "Why did they turn you away?" Xavier asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. "In town, I mean, if you don't mind me asking." Natalie had known the question would come eventually, had been steeling herself for it. "In Virginia City, I worked as a seamstress for a wealthy family. The husband tried to force his attentions on me, and when I refused and threatened to tell his wife, he spread rumors that I'd been trying to seduce him. His wife believed him, of course, and suddenly I was notorious. The scandal followed me here somehow, or maybe it's just that a woman alone always attracts suspicion." Xavier's hands tightened on the arms of his chair, and when she glanced at him, she saw genuine anger in his eyes. "That's the way of it, isn't it? Man does wrong, woman pays the price." "That's been my experience, yes." She was surprised by the bitterness in her own voice. "Well, for what it's worth, I believe you." Xavier's voice was firm, certain. "And anyone with eyes can see you're a good person, Natalie. The way you care for things, the way you work without being asked, the way you treat my horses like they matter. Character shows in the small things, not in what people say about you." Something warm unfurled in Natalie's chest at his words, something that felt dangerously like hope, like the beginning of trust. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means more than you know." A week passed, then two, and Natalie found herself settling into life on Xavier's ranch in ways she hadn't expected. She discovered he had a subtle sense of humor that caught her off guard, making her laugh over breakfast when he told stories about mishaps with stubborn horses. She learned he was patient and kind, gentle with the animals and respectful with her, never crossing any lines or making her feel uncomfortable despite them living in the same small house. She also learned he was somewhat isolated from the town, and gradually understood why. One afternoon, a neighboring rancher stopped by to discuss buying a horse, and Natalie heard the man's disparaging comments about Xavier being too soft, too willing to give people chances, too different from the harder men who made up most of the ranching community. Xavier had simply shrugged off the criticism, but she'd seen the flash of hurt in his eyes before he masked it. "Do they give you trouble?" she asked after the man had left, his horse deal rejected because Xavier wouldn't come down in price to what he considered unfair. "Sometimes." Xavier was brushing down one of the horses, his movements steady and soothing. "I don't do business the way they think I should. I'm fair with the railroad workers, with the Chinese laborers, with anyone who has honest money and treats the animals right. That makes me strange in their eyes. My father was the same way, taught me that a man's measure isn't in who he keeps out but in who he's willing to help up." Natalie stepped closer, drawn by an impulse she didn't quite understand. "Your father sounds like he was a good man." "He was the best man I ever knew." Xavier's voice was thick with emotion. "Lost him 4 years ago to pneumonia. Still miss him every day." Without thinking, Natalie reached out and touched his arm, a brief gesture of comfort, and felt him go still under her hand. When he turned to look at her, There was something in his eyes that made her breath catch, something intense and searching that spoke of feelings he wasn't ready to voice. She pulled her hand back, suddenly aware of the warmth of the barn, the intimacy of the moment, the way her heart was beating faster than it should. "I should start dinner," she said, and heard the slight tremor in her voice. "Natalie." The way he said her name stopped her at the barn door. She turned back, and he was standing there with the brush still in his hand, looking at her with an expression that was equal parts cautious and hopeful. "I'm glad you're here. I want you to know that. This house, it's been just a place I sleep since Sarah left, but now it feels like a home again." The confession hung in the air between them, vulnerable and honest, and Natalie felt something shift in her understanding of their situation, of what was happening here in this small ranch on the edge of Shoshone. She was falling for him, she realized with a start. Falling for this quiet, kind cowboy who'd opened his door when everyone else had slammed theirs shut, who treated her with respect and listened when she talked and made her feel like maybe she could trust again. "I'm glad I'm here too," she managed to say, and saw the way his face brightened at her words, the way a smile transformed his serious features into something that made her stomach flutter. That night as she lay in bed, Natalie thought about Xavier's words, about the way he'd looked at her, about the growing feelings she couldn't deny anymore. She thought about the risk of opening her heart again, about the possibility of being hurt or rejected or used. But she also thought about the way Xavier listened to her, really listened, the way he never made her feel less than or broken or tainted by what others had said. He saw her, truly saw her, and that was terrifying and wonderful all at once. The next morning she woke to find Xavier already up and working, and when she went out to the barn with a basket of clean laundry she'd brought in from the line, she found him struggling with a young horse that was clearly frightened and skittish. "Easy now," Xavier was saying in a low, soothing voice. "Nobody's going to hurt you, I promise. You're safe here." The horse, a beautiful chestnut mare with white socks, was trembling, her eyes rolling with fear, and Natalie recognized the expression because she'd felt that way herself not so long ago. She set down the basket and approached slowly, and Xavier glanced at her with surprise but didn't tell her to leave. She started humming softly, an old lullaby her father used to sing, and gradually the mare's ears swiveled toward her, the trembling lessening slightly. "Someone hurt her bad," Xavier said quietly. "Bought her off a fellow who was using the whip too freely. She's going to take time to trust again." "Time helps," Natalie said, moving a little closer, still humming. "And patience, and someone showing you that not all people are cruel." Xavier looked at her then, and she knew he understood they weren't just talking about the horse anymore. "You have a way with her. She's responding to you." Natalie reached out slowly, letting the mare smell her hand, waiting for permission before gently touching the soft nose. The horse didn't bolt, just stood there breathing hard, allowing the tentative contact. "We understand each other, I think. We both know what it's like to be afraid." They worked together with the mare for the next hour, Xavier watching as Natalie gradually built trust with the frightened animal, her patience and gentleness winning out over fear. By the time they finished, the mare was eating grain from Natalie's hand, and Xavier was looking at her with undisguised admiration. "You're something special, you know that." The words came out rough, almost awkward, and she could see he hadn't meant to say them out loud. Natalie felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't look away. "I'm just someone who knows what it's like to be scared and alone. You're not alone anymore." Xavier stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from him. "Not if you don't want to be." Her breath caught in her throat, and for a long moment they just stood there in the quiet barn with dust motes dancing in the sunlight streaming through the slats, the mare peacefully eating behind them. The whole world narrowed down to this moment, this choice. Natalie could feel her walls crumbling, the careful defenses she'd built against being hurt again, and it was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. "Xavier, I need to tell you something." The words tumbled out before she could stop them. "I'm scared. Scared of what I'm feeling, scared of trusting again, scared of letting myself care about you and then having it all fall apart." His hand came up slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and cupped her cheek with a gentleness that made tears prick her eyes. "I'm scared too. Scared I'm not good enough. Scared I'll disappoint you. Scared you'll wake up one day and realize you could do better than a struggling rancher who's too different for this town. But I'm more scared of not taking this chance, of letting you slip away because I was too cowardly to tell you that you matter to me. You matter more than I know how to say." The tears spilled over then, but they were good tears, healing tears, and when Xavier brushed them away with his thumb she leaned into the touch, letting herself be vulnerable in a way she hadn't allowed since everything fell apart in Virginia City. "I don't want to slip away," she whispered. "I don't want to leave. Then stay." His voice was rough with emotion. "Not as someone renting a room, not as someone working off a debt. Stay because you want to be here, because this feels right to you the way it feels right to me. Stay and let's see where this goes together." Natalie reached up and covered his hand with hers, holding it against her cheek. "Yes," she said simply, and watched joy transform his face, making him look young and hopeful and so handsome it made her heart ache. Xavier leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to change her mind, and when their lips finally met it was gentle and sweet and full of promise. Natalie kissed him back, her hands coming up to rest on his chest where she could feel his heart pounding as hard as her own, and thought that maybe, just maybe, good things could still happen to broken people who were brave enough to trust again. They pulled apart reluctantly, both breathing harder, and Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that for 2 weeks," he admitted. "Ever since you showed up looking fierce and scared all at once, and something in me just knew you were important. I thought you were just being kind." Natalie laughed shakily. "I didn't dare hope it could be more. It's definitely more." Xavier kissed her again, longer this time, and she melted into him, feeling safe and wanted and precious in a way she'd almost forgotten was possible. Over the following weeks, their relationship deepened and grew, a steady building of intimacy and trust that felt natural as breathing. Xavier taught Natalie to ride, his patience endless as she learned to control the gentle gelding he'd chosen for her, and she taught him to dance in the kitchen by lamplight, humming the tunes since they had no music. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, learning each other's dreams and fears and quirks, building a foundation of friendship alongside the growing passion. Natalie still didn't go into town often, though she'd gone with Xavier once to buy supplies and felt the weight of judgment from many of the townspeople. But she'd also noticed a few people who nodded at her respectfully, following Xavier's lead, and she realized that his quiet acceptance of her was slowly changing minds, making a difference in small but meaningful ways. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, Xavier took her hand in his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Natalie, I need to ask you something, and I want you to feel free to say no if it's too soon or if you're not ready." Her heart started beating faster, and she turned to look at him, seeing the nervousness in his expression. "What is it?" "I love you." The words came out simple and direct, and she could hear the truth of them in his voice. "I think I've loved you since that first day when you looked at me like you were daring me to be different from all the rest. like you still had hope left despite everything. And I don't want to rush you or pressure you, but I also don't want to waste time pretending this is casual when it's the most important thing in my life." Natalie's eyes filled with tears again, but she was smiling through them. "I love you too." I was afraid to say it, afraid if I admitted it out loud something would happen to take it away, but I do, Xavier. I love you so much it scares me. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest, and she could hear his heart racing beneath her ear. "Will you marry me? Not right away if you need time, but someday. Will you be my wife and let me spend the rest of my life proving that my door will always be open for you, that you'll always have a home with me?" "Yes." Natalie pulled back to look at him, to let him see the certainty in her eyes. "Yes, I'll marry you. I don't need time to know this is what I want, that you're what I want." Xavier kissed her then, deep and passionate, and when they finally broke apart they were both laughing and crying at the same time, giddy with happiness and the sheer relief of having found each other against all odds. They stayed up late that night making plans, talking about the future, about when they should marry and how they would build their life together. And Natalie felt a peace settle over her that she'd never experienced before. A sense of coming home that had nothing to do with buildings and everything to do with the man sitting beside her holding her hand like she was precious. They were married 3 weeks later in Xavier's front room, with his sister Sarah and her husband making the trip from Boise to stand as witnesses, and the local minister performing the ceremony, despite some of the congregation's objections. Sarah had embraced Natalie immediately, welcoming her as a sister, and Natalie felt the last piece of her broken heart heal at that acceptance, at being part of a family again. The wedding was simple but beautiful. Natalie wearing a dress she'd made herself from fabric. Xavier had insisted on buying her, pale blue with white lace at the collar and cuffs. And Xavier in his best suit looking handsome and nervous and so full of love, it made her breath catch. When he said his vows, his voice was steady and sure, promising to love and cherish her, to stand beside her against whatever the world might throw at them, to make sure she never doubted her worth or her place in his life. Natalie's own vows came from the heart, promising to trust him even when fear whispered lies, to build a home full of love and laughter with him, to be his partner in all things. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife and Xavier kissed her, she felt transformed. No longer the woman who'd been turned away from every door, but the woman who'd been brave enough to walk through the one that opened just for her. That night as they lay together in Xavier's room, now their room, Natalie traced the lines of his face in the moonlight streaming through the window. "Do you ever regret it, taking a chance on me that first day?" Xavier caught her hand and kissed her palm. "Never, not once. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Natalie Pearson. You brought light and warmth and love into a house that was just lonely walls before you. You made me remember what it feels like to really live instead of just existing. You saved me," she said softly. "When everyone else saw someone to avoid, you saw someone worth knowing. You gave me back my faith in goodness." "We saved each other," Xavier corrected, pulling her closer. "That's what love does. It makes us braver and stronger and better than we could be alone." They made love then, gentle and passionate and full of all the emotions they'd been holding back. And afterward, Natalie lay wrapped in her husband's arms thinking that she'd never been happier, never felt more complete. The journey that had brought her to Shoshone had been painful and frightening, but it had led her here, to this man, to this love. And she wouldn't change a single moment of it because every hardship had been necessary to bring them together. Life on the ranch settled into a rhythm over the following months. Natalie threw herself into making their home beautiful and welcoming, sewing new curtains, planting a vegetable garden, even convincing Xavier to let her repaint the outside of the house a cheerful white that made it stand out against the brown landscape. She also started taking in sewing work, her skill becoming known beyond the town's prejudice, and soon she had a small but steady stream of customers who cared more about her talent than her past. Xavier's horse breeding operation grew as well, his reputation for training animals with patience rather than force spreading throughout Idaho and even into Wyoming. They worked side by side, Natalie often helping with the gentler aspects of training while Xavier handled the more difficult cases, and their partnership extended into every aspect of their lives. They made decisions together, supported each other's dreams, and built something strong and lasting through their shared commitment and love. The town's attitude toward Natalie began to shift gradually as people saw her dedication to Xavier, saw the way their marriage thrived, saw that she was a good woman who'd been judged unfairly. It started small, a nod from the general store owner, a genuine smile from a woman at church, an invitation to join the quilting circle that met on Thursday afternoons. Not everyone came around, but enough did that Natalie began to feel like part of the community rather than an outsider. And she knew it was largely because Xavier had never wavered in his acceptance of her, had shown through his actions that she was worthy of respect. A year after their wedding, Natalie realized she was pregnant, and the joy she felt was matched only by Xavier's reaction when she told him. He'd picked her up and spun her around in the kitchen, laughing and crying at the same time, then set her down gently as if she might break, already protective of the life growing inside her. They spent the evening making plans, discussing names and rearranging the spare room into a nursery, and Natalie felt grateful beyond measure that her child would grow up in a home filled with love, with parents who chose each other every day. The pregnancy was relatively easy, and Natalie continued working around the ranch as much as Xavier would allow, which wasn't as much as she wanted since he insisted on taking over the heavier chores and watching her like a hawk for any signs of distress. She found his protectiveness endearing rather than suffocating, understanding it came from a place of deep love rather than a desire to control her. Their son was born on a cold February morning in 1884, arriving with a lusty cry that announced his presence to the world in no uncertain terms. Xavier was there through the whole labor, holding Natalie's hand and whispering encouragement, refusing to leave even when the midwife Sarah had brought from Boise suggested he might be more comfortable waiting outside. When he finally held his son for the first time, the look on his face was something Natalie knew she'd remember forever. Pure wonder and love and fierce protectiveness all mixed together. They named him Marcus, after Xavier's father, and he was a healthy baby with dark hair like his mother and his father's brown eyes. Xavier was a natural father, patient and gentle, taking to night feedings and diaper changes without complaint, and Natalie watched him with their son and felt her love deepen even more, seeing new dimensions to the man she'd married. The next few years were full and happy, with Marcus growing into a bright, active little boy who loved the horses and followed his father around the ranch like a shadow. Natalie's sewing business continued to grow, and she even began designing dresses for some of the wealthier families in the area, her reputation spreading beyond Shoshone. Xavier expanded the ranch, buying more land and building a bigger barn, and their hard work paid off in a comfortable life that felt like a miracle considering where they'd both started. When Marcus was 3, their daughter arrived, a tiny thing with her mother's features and a temperament that was sweet and gentle from the start. They named her Emma, and she completed their family in a way they hadn't even known was missing. Xavier doted on his daughter, this little girl who had him wrapped around her finger from the moment she opened her eyes. And Natalie often found them together. Emma chattering away in toddler language while Xavier listened seriously and responded as if she was making perfect sense. One evening when Marcus was 5 and Emma was 2, Xavier and Natalie sat on their porch after putting the children to bed, watching the sun set in spectacular colors across the Idaho sky. Xavier had his arm around her shoulders, and she was leaning into him, both of them tired from a long day but content in that bone-deep way that comes from a life well lived. "You ever think about that first day?" Xavier asked. "When you walked up to my ranch with your little satchel and looked like you were ready to fight the whole world if necessary." Natalie smiled at the memory. "I think about it often. I think about how scared I was, how certain I was that I'd never find a place to belong. And then you opened your door." "My door opens only for you," Xavier said softly, repeating the words he'd told her early in their relationship, words that had become something of a private joke between them but also a profound truth. "Then and now and always. You're my home, Natalie. You and our children, this life we've built, it's everything I never knew I needed. You're my home too." Natalie turned to kiss him, the gesture familiar after years of marriage but still full of warmth and love. "You took a chance on me when nobody else would, and you gave me everything. A home, a family, a future I'd stopped believing in. I love you more than I can ever express." "Then show me every day for the rest of our lives," Xavier said, his eyes twinkling with the humor she'd come to love. "I think that might be enough time to get the message across." She laughed and settled back against him, looking out at the land they'd built together, at the house that had gone from a lonely bachelor's dwelling to a true home, at the barn where horses moved peacefully in the evening light, at the mountains that stood eternal and beautiful in the distance. This was her life now, so different from anything she could have imagined when she'd stepped off that train in Shoshone feeling desperate and alone. The years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges as they always do, but Xavier and Natalie faced everything together. Their love the foundation that held steady through difficult seasons and abundant ones alike. Marcus grew into a thoughtful young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did, learning the business and showing a natural talent for horse training. Emma developed a gift for drawing and painting, capturing the beauty of their Idaho home in sketches and watercolors that showed real artistic promise. When Marcus was 15 and Emma was 12, they welcomed another surprise, a daughter they named Claire who arrived with red hair nobody could quite account for until Sarah reminded them that their grandmother had been a redhead, genetics reaching back through generations. Claire was a firecracker from the start, bold and adventurous, and she kept them all on their toes with her endless energy and curiosity. The ranch continued to prosper, becoming known throughout the region as the place to go for well-trained horses and fair dealing. Xavier's reputation as an honest man and skilled horseman spreading far beyond Shoshone. Natalie's sewing business had evolved into a small dress shop in town, run mostly by 2 young women she'd trained, but with Natalie still designing the more elaborate pieces and handling the wealthier clients who appreciated her eye for detail and quality. Shoshone itself had grown and changed over the years, the railroad bringing more people and more prosperity, and the town that had once turned Natalie away now counted her among its most respected citizens. She'd never forgotten those early rejections, but she'd learned to forgive them, understanding that people were often more scared than cruel, more ignorant than malicious, and that minds could change when given the chance. One particular satisfaction came when Martha Wilson, the boarding house owner who'd been first to refuse Natalie shelter, came to her dress shop to commission a wedding dress for her daughter. The woman had been stiff and awkward, clearly uncomfortable, but Natalie had treated her with professionalism and even kindness, measuring the daughter and discussing designs without any reference to that long-ago rejection. After the appointment, as Martha was leaving, she turned back at the door. "Mrs. Pearson, I owe you an apology." The words came out stilted, difficult. "I was wrong about you, wrong to turn you away that day. You've proven yourself to be a woman of good character, and I'm ashamed of how I treated you." Natalie could have been cruel, could have thrown the apology back in the woman's face, but Xavier's kindness had taught her a better way. We all make mistakes based on fear or incomplete information. What matters is being willing to change when we learn better. Your apology is accepted, Mrs. Wilson, and I'll make sure your daughter has the most beautiful wedding dress I've ever created. The relief on Martha's face had been profound, and Natalie knew that in that moment she'd done something important, broken a cycle of judgment and resentment, chosen grace over bitterness. When she told Xavier about it that evening, he'd pulled her into his arms and told her he was proud of her, that she was teaching their children by example what it meant to be truly strong. The children grew and thrived, Marcus eventually marrying a sweet girl from a neighboring ranch and taking over more of the day-to-day operations from Xavier, who was content to step back and enjoy a slower pace. Emma moved to Boise to study art, her talent earning her a place at a small but prestigious school, though she came home often and always spoke of eventually returning to Idaho permanently. Claire, true to her nature, was still figuring out what she wanted, trying everything from helping with the horses to learning her mother's sewing skills to working at the general store, her restless energy seeking its proper outlet. As Xavier and Natalie moved into their 40s and then 50s, they often reflected on the strange journey that had brought them together. Xavier's hair went silver at the temples, and Natalie found lines around her eyes from years of laughter and sun. But they both agreed they'd never been happier than in these years of watching their family grow and their love deepen with time. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't stopped when you walked up to the ranch that day?" Xavier asked one lazy Sunday afternoon as they sat together on the porch, a ritual they'd maintained through all the years of their marriage. Natalie considered the question seriously. "I think I would have survived somehow. I've always been a survivor. But I wouldn't have lived, not really. You taught me the difference between surviving and thriving, between existing and truly being alive. Without you, I might have made it through, but I would have missed out on the best parts of life, the love and partnership and family we've built." "I was so lonely before you came," Xavier admitted, something he rarely spoke about. "Didn't even realize how much until you were here, and suddenly the house felt alive again. My door opened for you because it was like some part of me recognized you, knew you were meant to be here." "Maybe that's what love is," Natalie mused. "Recognizing the person who's meant to walk through your door, even when the whole world is telling them they don't belong anywhere." Xavier kissed her temple, a gesture of affection that never got old. "Then I'm grateful I was paying attention that day. Most important decision I ever made, choosing to help you." "Second most important," Natalie corrected with a smile. "The first was choosing to love me, to keep choosing me every day after that." "That wasn't a choice," Xavier said seriously. "That was inevitable, still is. I couldn't stop loving you if I tried, and believe me, I have no interest in trying." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in those familiar Idaho colors they'd watched together for decades now, and Natalie thought about how far they'd both come. From that frightened woman being turned away from every door to this contented wife and mother sitting beside the love of her life. The journey had been long and sometimes painful, but ultimately perfect, because it led here, to this moment, to this peace. Marcus and his wife, Helen, had given them 3 grandchildren, 2 girls and a boy, and watching Xavier with those grandchildren made Natalie fall in love with him all over again. He was patient and playful, teaching them about horses and the land, passing down the wisdom his own father had given him, and she could see the legacy they were building, not just in land and horses, but in values and love that would extend through generations. Emma had indeed returned to Idaho after finishing her studies, bringing with her a quiet man named Thomas, who appreciated her art and her wild spirit. They'd settled in Boise, but visited often, Emma's paintings adorning the walls of the ranch house, beautiful representations of the land and family she loved. She and Thomas had one daughter, a thoughtful child who showed signs of inheriting her mother's artistic gifts. Claire, ever the surprise, had fallen in love with the son of the general store owner and taken to retail like a natural, eventually running the store with innovations and energy that made it the busiest in town. She and her husband had twin boys who were as full of energy as their mother had been, and family gatherings were loud and chaotic and wonderful. As Xavier and Natalie entered their 60s, they finally slowed down significantly, content to let Marcus run the ranch while they enjoyed the fruits of their decades of labor. They traveled a little, taking the train to see Emma in Boise, visiting the Oregon coast once to see the ocean, but always happy to return home to their ranch outside Shoshone, to the mountains and the wide sky and the land they loved. One evening, as they prepared for bed, moving through the familiar routines of a lifetime together, Xavier caught Natalie's hand and pulled her close. "I have something I want to say, and I need you to let me get through it without interrupting." Natalie felt a flutter of concern but nodded, seeing the seriousness in his expression. "When you walked up to my ranch 40 years ago, I was going through the motions of living but not really alive. I'd convinced myself I was fine alone, that I didn't need anyone, but the truth was I was just scared of taking the risk of opening my heart. Then there you were, dusty and desperate and still so brave, and something in me woke up." Xavier cupped her face in his weathered hands. "You've given me everything, Natalie. A real home, children I'm proud of, grandchildren who bring me joy, and a love I didn't know existed outside of books. Every single day for 40 years, I've thanked whatever power of the universe brought you to my door." Natalie's eyes filled with tears. "Xavier, you gave me just as much. You gave me a place to belong when the world said I didn't belong anywhere. You saw me, the real me, and loved what you saw even when I couldn't love myself. You've been my partner and my best friend and the love of my life. We've had a good run, haven't we?" Xavier said, and she heard the emotion thick in his voice. "Built something worth being proud of. The best run." Natalie kissed him softly. "And we're not done yet. We've got years left, more grandchildren to spoil, more sunsets to watch from that porch. Promise me something," Xavier said. "Promise me you'll remember, always, that you are worthy of every good thing. That what those people said about you all those years ago was wrong. That you've proven every single day since who you really are, and that I consider myself the luckiest man alive to have been your husband. I promise." Natalie held him tight, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. "And you promise me you'll remember that you're my hero, not because you rescued me, but because you stood beside me and believed in me until I could believe in myself again. You're the best man I've ever known, Xavier Pearson, and loving you has been the greatest privilege of my life." They held each other for a long time, two people who'd found each other against the odds and built a lifetime of love from a single moment of compassion. When they finally climbed into bed, They lay close together the way they had every night of their marriage, finding comfort in proximity, in the familiar warmth of the person who knew them best. The years that followed were gentle ones, full of family gatherings and quiet days and the deep satisfaction that comes from a life well lived. Xavier and Natalie watched their grandchildren grow, welcomed great-grandchildren, saw their family expand in ways that filled their hearts to bursting. The ranch continued to thrive under Marcus's management. The dress shop remained successful under new ownership, but still bearing Natalie's design influence. And their children all built good lives, strong marriages, happy families. When Xavier died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, Natalie beside him as she'd been for nearly 50 years, the whole town of Shoshone turned out for his funeral. Not just because he'd been a successful rancher or a fair businessman, but because he'd been a good man who treated everyone with dignity, who helped where he could, who'd spent his life proving that kindness was strength, not weakness. Natalie grieved deeply but without bitterness, grateful for the years they'd had, the love they'd shared, the legacy they'd built together. She lived another 5 years, surrounded by family, still sharp and engaged, still sewing occasionally and telling stories to her great-grandchildren about the grandfather they'd lost, but would remember through her words. On a warm summer evening, sitting on the porch of the ranch house she'd made a home so long ago, Natalie passed away quietly, a smile on her face as if she was seeing something beautiful. Her children and grandchildren believed she'd gone to find Xavier, to continue the love story that had defined both their lives. They buried her beside Xavier on a hill overlooking the ranch, and at the funeral, Marcus told the story finally of how his parents had met, how his mother had been turned away from every door in Shoshone until she'd walked up to a lonely ranch where a cowboy with a kind heart had said his door opened only for her. The story became part of family legend, told and retold through generations, a reminder that sometimes the best things in life come from moments of compassion, from choosing love over judgment, from being brave enough to walk through a door someone opens just for you. The ranch stayed in the family for generations. The dress shop bearing Natalie's designs influenced fashion in Idaho for decades. But their real legacy was the love they'd modeled, the way they'd shown their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren that true partnership was built on respect and kindness, and choosing each other every single day. Xavier and Natalie's story became the kind of romance people pointed to when they talked about real love, the kind that lasted and grew and transformed two lonely people into a family that spread like roots through the Idaho soil they'd both loved. And in Shoshone, which had once turned away a desperate woman, people remembered and told the story with a mixture of pride and shame, proud that the town had eventually welcomed Natalie Pearson and recognized her worth, ashamed that it had taken one man's courage to show them what they should have seen from the start. The story served as a reminder to each new generation that judgment comes easy, but compassion requires courage, and that the doors we open or close can change not just individual lives, but the character of an entire community. The ranch house stood for over a century, eventually preserved as a historical landmark, and people would visit to see where the famous love story had unfolded, to stand on the porch where Xavier and Natalie had watched so many sunsets together, to walk the land where they'd built their life and raised their family. And always, the tour guides would tell the story of how it began, of a woman refused at every door in town and a cowboy who'd said his door opened only for her, and visitors would leave thinking about the doors they opened or closed in their own lives, the chances they took or missed, the courage required to love someone the world had rejected. In the end, Xavier and Natalie's story was about more than romance, though the love was real and deep and lasting. It was about the choice to see people as they truly are rather than as reputation paints them, about the courage to stand against judgment and prejudice, about the way one act of kindness can ripple through time and change not just two lives, but countless others touched by the love that grew from that single decision. Their door had opened for each other, and through it they'd walked into a future neither could have imagined, a love neither had dared to hope for, and a life that proved sometimes the best things come to those who are brave enough to keep knocking even when every other door has slammed shut.